There's a specific kind of fear that develops differently from other fears in an abusive relationship, and it's worth naming precisely because it doesn't announce itself the way a raised fist or a screamed threat does. It's the fear that settles into your body the moment you hear car keys jingle a certain way, the fear that makes you instinctively check who's driving before you get in, the fear that turns an ordinary, everyday act, riding in a car with someone you love, into something your nervous system quietly, persistently treats as a potential threat. If you've experienced this, you already know it's real, even if you've struggled to explain it clearly to anyone who hasn't lived through it. Before we go further, an important note, because this topic deserves it directly rather than only at the end. What we're describing today touches genuine physical safety, not simply psychological manipulation in the abstract sense this series has more commonly traced. If anything here resonates with fear for your actual physical safety, please know that domestic violence resources exist specifically for this, and reaching out to them isn't an overreaction. We'll return to specific resources at the end, but I want that said clearly now too, in case you need it before we finish. Let's talk about why vehicles specifically become a tool for intimidation in these relationships, because understanding the mechanism explains why this particular tactic is so effective and so often minimized or dismissed by people who haven't experienced it directly. A car occupies a unique position in daily life, worth understanding precisely. It's an enclosed mobile space where you have limited control over your own physical safety, where exit isn't simple or immediate, and where the person driving holds direct, literal power over your body's movement through the world. This combination, confinement, mobility, and direct physical control, makes a vehicle uniquely suited to intimidation in a way few other everyday objects can match. Here's what's worth understanding about how this tactic typically develops, because it rarely begins as something overtly dangerous. It often starts small, easy to dismiss or explain away. Sudden acceleration when upset, harder braking than necessary, driving somewhat faster than comfortable during an argument. These early instances are worth naming precisely because they often get minimized by you and by the person doing it as simply reflecting frustration or distraction rather than deliberate intimidation. This minimization matters because it allows the pattern to continue and gradually escalate without ever crossing a single obvious line significant enough to demand immediate, decisive response. Let's talk about the first specific pattern worth recognizing directly. Driving behavior that shifts noticeably and specifically during conflict, distinct from how the same person drives during ordinary, calm circumstances. This is worth understanding as genuinely diagnostic, because it reveals something important about intent. If someone's driving remains relatively consistent regardless of their emotional state, this suggests their driving style is simply a general personality trait, worth addressing in its own right, but not necessarily a tool of intimidation specifically. If someone's driving changes dramatically and specifically during moments of anger or conflict, faster acceleration, harder turns, closer following distance to other vehicles, sudden jarring braking, this pattern is worth taking considerably more seriously because it suggests the driving itself is being used, whether consciously or not, as an extension of their anger, directed specifically at you as a captive passenger. Here's why this specific pattern is so effective as intimidation, and it's worth naming the mechanism clearly. A car moving at speed represents genuine, undeniable physical danger, and everyone in the vehicle knows this at some visceral, immediate level. When someone deliberately or semi-deliberately uses this genuine danger as a tool during conflict, they're accessing something considerably more primal and considerably more effective than verbal intimidation alone. Your body doesn't need convincing that a car moving dangerously fast is a threat. It already knows, immediately and completely, which is precisely why this particular form of intimidation produces such intense, immediate fear, often before your conscious mind has even fully registered what's happening. Let's talk about a second specific pattern worth recognizing: the deliberate use of location and control over the destination as a form of coercion, particularly refusing to stop the vehicle or refusing to let you out when you've clearly directly requested it. This is worth understanding as a distinct escalation from erratic driving alone, because it removes something crucial: your basic ability to remove yourself from the situation. Someone who drives erratically but stops immediately when asked is engaging in one specific form of concerning behavior. Someone who refuses to stop, who continues driving despite direct requests to be let out, who uses the vehicle's motion itself as a way of preventing your exit from the conflict, has moved into something considerably more serious, a genuine restriction of your physical freedom and safety, not simply frightening behavior within an otherwise ordinary drive. This is worth naming directly because it connects to something worth understanding as a core feature of coercive control more broadly: the deliberate removal of your ability to exit an uncomfortable or dangerous situation. In most contexts, this removal happens through psychological or social mechanisms: isolation, financial control, erosion of self-trust. A vehicle offers something more direct and more immediately, physically undeniable: literal, physical prevention of your ability to leave, using the simple mechanics of a moving car as the actual physical barrier. Let's talk about a third pattern worth recognizing, one that's particularly insidious because it often gets dismissed, even by people experiencing it directly, as simply an unpleasant personality quirk rather than genuine intimidation. Threats to your safety or well-being specifically delivered while driving, timed deliberately to coincide with the vulnerability of being a passenger with limited control. This might include verbal threats delivered while accelerating or driving aggressively, explicit or implicit references to the danger of the current driving as leverage during an argument, or comments specifically designed to remind you, in that exact moment, of your own physical vulnerability while trapped inside a moving vehicle they control. This is worth understanding as a deliberate combination of psychological and physical intimidation, considerably more effective than either alone. The threat gains power specifically because it's delivered in a context where physical danger is already genuinely, undeniably present, making the psychological threat feel considerably more real and considerably more immediate than the same words would feel in a safer, more stationary context. This combination is precisely why vehicle-based intimidation tends to produce such lasting, persistent fear. Fear that can resurface, unexpectedly, for years afterward, triggered simply by being a passenger in any car, even with someone who has never actually shown any similar behavior at all. What we haven't yet explored are the remaining patterns worth recognizing, how they tend to escalate over time if left unaddressed, and what genuine, practical safety planning specifically related to this particular tactic actually requires, which is exactly where we need to go next, along with the safety resources this topic genuinely deserves. Let's talk about a fourth pattern worth recognizing directly, one that connects to something we've traced throughout other explorations in this series regarding isolation and control over practical resources. Deliberate manipulation of access to transportation itself as a means of restricting your independence, separate from any specific instance of dangerous driving. This might include controlling when and whether you have access to a vehicle, insisting on being the one who always drives regardless of your own preference or capability, or deliberately stranding you somewhere without transportation as a form of punishment or control during a conflict. This is worth understanding as a distinct pattern from the erratic or threatening driving we discussed in Part 1, because it operates through restriction rather than through direct, in-the-moment fear. Someone who consistently controls your access to transportation is limiting your practical ability to leave difficult situations, to maintain independent relationships and activities, and to exit the relationship entirely should that eventually become necessary. This connects directly to something we traced extensively in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding practical resource control, and it's worth recognizing transportation specifically as one of the most significant practical resources, because without independent access to it, many other forms of independence become considerably harder to maintain or act upon. Let's talk about a fifth pattern, one that deserves particular attention because it represents a genuine escalation beyond intimidation into something considerably more directly threatening: deliberately positioning a vehicle in ways designed to block your path, prevent you from leaving a location, or create a genuine sense of being physically trapped, even outside the context of an actual drive. This might include blocking a driveway to prevent you from leaving in your own vehicle, following your car closely and aggressively when you're driving separately, or using a parked vehicle to physically block your exit from a parking space or location. This is worth understanding as a genuinely serious escalation, considerably beyond the earlier patterns we've discussed, because it involves the deliberate use of a vehicle's physical mass specifically to restrict your movement and freedom, regardless of whether the vehicle is actually in motion at the time. If you've experienced this specific pattern, being deliberately blocked, followed, or trapped through the positioning of a vehicle, this deserves to be taken with the same seriousness as any other form of physical restriction or intimidation, because that's precisely what it represents. Let's talk about how these patterns tend to escalate over time if left unaddressed, because understanding this trajectory matters for accurate risk assessment going forward. Remember something worth naming directly, connecting to patterns we've traced throughout this entire series regarding narcissistic behavior more broadly. Intimidation tactics that succeed in producing fear and compliance tend to be repeated and often intensified over time, precisely because they've proven effective at achieving whatever underlying goal, control, punishment, or dominance they were originally deployed to achieve. Vehicle-based intimidation follows this same general pattern. Early instances of mildly aggressive driving during conflict left unaddressed often escalate over time into more severe, erratic driving, then potentially into refusal to stop or let you exit, then potentially into more direct forms of physical trapping or blocking. This escalation pattern is worth understanding, not to produce fear about an inevitable, predetermined future, but to support accurate, proactive safety assessment rather than continued minimization of early warning signs. If you've experienced even the earliest, seemingly mild versions of these patterns, mild but noticeable driving changes during conflict, this is worth taking seriously as genuine information, rather than continuing to explain it away as simply reflecting frustration or a difficult day, precisely because minimization is exactly what allows this specific pattern to continue developing, unaddressed, toward its more severe and more dangerous forms. Now let's talk about what genuine, practical safety planning specifically related to this tactic actually requires, because this deserves direct, concrete attention rather than remaining abstract. If you're currently experiencing any of the patterns we've traced throughout this exploration, several practical steps are worth considering directly. First, whenever possible, avoid being a passenger in situations where conflict is likely or already occurring, maintaining independent transportation and independent ability to leave any specific location without depending on someone whose driving has become unpredictable or intimidating during difficult moments. Second, if you find yourself in a vehicle where driving has become frightening or dangerous, prioritize clearly, calmly stating a direct request to stop and let you exit. And if this request is refused, understand that this refusal itself represents significant, serious information about the situation you're actually in, deserving of serious response rather than continued minimization. Third, document specific instances of this pattern when it's safe to do so, dates, specific behaviors, any witnesses who might have been present, because this kind of documentation, as we've discussed in other explorations throughout this series, matters considerably if you ever need to explain this pattern to a therapist, an attorney, or law enforcement. And fourth, and this deserves real emphasis, if you're experiencing genuine fear about your physical safety related to this or any other pattern, please reach out to a domestic violence hotline or advocate specifically trained in safety planning for exactly these kinds of situations. This brings us to the final part of this exploration, where we need to address directly what this entire pattern reveals about the underlying psychology driving it, why understanding this psychology matters for your own healing even after leaving, and, most importantly, the specific safety resources this topic genuinely, urgently deserves. Let's talk about what this entire pattern reveals about the underlying psychology driving it, because understanding this matters, not to excuse the behavior, but to help you accurately locate where responsibility for it actually belongs, particularly as you work through the aftermath of experiencing it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic and abusive psychology depends on maintaining control, and how that control, when threatened or when other tactics have stopped producing the desired compliance, tends to escalate rather than diminish. Vehicle-based intimidation fits directly into this larger pattern, functioning as one of the most physically direct, most immediately effective tools available for maintaining control, precisely because it accesses genuine, undeniable physical vulnerability rather than relying solely on psychological or emotional leverage. This is worth understanding as connecting directly to the broader theme of coercive control this entire series has traced throughout its full length. Someone who uses a vehicle to intimidate you isn't behaving erratically or losing control in some random, unpredictable sense, even though the driving itself might genuinely feel erratic and unpredictable in the moment. The underlying pattern is considerably more purposeful than it appears. A deliberate, if not always fully conscious use of genuine physical danger as a tool for producing fear, compliance, and continued control, functioning within the same overall structure of coercive control. This entire series has examined from many different angles throughout its considerable length. Let's talk about why this understanding matters for your own healing, even well after leaving a situation involving this specific pattern. Because vehicle-related fear often persists in ways that surprise and confuse people who assumed leaving the relationship would automatically resolve it. Many survivors describe ongoing anxiety specifically related to being passengers, even with people who have never displayed any similar behavior, a lingering hypervigilance around driving speed, sudden braking, or any sensation that even faintly echoes what was once genuinely dangerous. This is worth understanding as a normal, expected response to genuine, sustained threat, not evidence of excessive sensitivity or an inability to move past what happened. Your nervous system learned, through direct, repeated experience, that vehicles could become genuinely dangerous, and unlearning this association takes genuine time and, often, genuine professional support specifically trained in trauma response. If this specific kind of lingering fear resonates with your own experience, it's worth understanding as entirely legitimate, worth addressing directly with a trauma-informed therapist, rather than something you should expect to simply resolve on its own through time alone. Trauma responses connected to genuine, sustained physical danger often require specific, deliberate therapeutic support in order to genuinely heal, rather than being expected to fade automatically the way ordinary discomfort might. Let's close this exploration with something crucial: the safety resources this topic genuinely, urgently deserves, because everything we've traced throughout this exploration exists specifically to help you take this pattern seriously, rather than continuing to minimize or explain away behavior that deserves real, direct attention. If you've recognized any of the patterns we've discussed today in your own life, driving that changes dangerously during conflict, refusal to stop or let you exit a vehicle, deliberate blocking or trapping through vehicle positioning, or control over your access to transportation more broadly, please understand that these patterns represent genuine safety concerns, not simply difficult relationship dynamics to be managed through better communication or increased patience. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 in the United States at 1-800-799-7233, staffed by advocates specifically trained in safety planning for exactly these kinds of situations, including the specific complexities involved when transportation itself has become a tool of control. If you're outside the United States, a quick search will connect you with your country's equivalent resource. Reaching out doesn't require certainty that your situation has become dangerous enough to warrant help. If any part of you is wondering whether it has, that wondering itself is worth taking seriously and worth bringing to someone trained specifically to help you think it through safely. So if you've recognized your own experience somewhere in what we've traced throughout this exploration, let this be what you carry forward. The fear you've felt in that passenger seat, the instinct to check who's driving before you get in, the relief of finally having your own independent transportation. None of this was excessive or irrational. It was your body accurately, reliably recognizing genuine danger, long before you may have had the language to fully explain what you were sensing. That recognition deserves to be trusted, supported by real resources, and acted on with the same seriousness you'd extend to any other genuine threat to your physical safety, because that's precisely, accurately, what this pattern represents.